In the dim glow of England's early 17th century, in a world that still believed monarchs carried God's breath in their lungs and divine judgment in their blood, a secret rotted quietly behind the velvet curtains of power. The world saw a radiant queen, a woman who crushed the mighty Spanish Armada, forged a golden age of culture, and held a kingdom together with little more than willpower and a jeweled crown. But what the world did not see, what no portrait painter dared reveal, and no historian of her day would ever write, was that Queen Elizabeth, the eternal Virgin Queen, the immortal symbol of beauty and authority, was decaying while still alive, and her body was betraying her in ways so grotesque they bordered on the supernatural. Outside, England praised her as untouchable. Inside, her ladies whispered prayers under their breath as they approached her, keeping their eyes lowered so they would not flinch at the truth hidden beneath her mask of white. The same cosmetics that had helped her build an empire of illusion were eating her alive, stripping away her flesh layer by layer, as if trying to uncover the woman beneath the myth. Elizabeth knew this, and she continued anyway, because she understood the cruel equation of her time. If her beauty collapsed, her power collapsed with it. The nightmare began with what the world believed made her beautiful. Each morning, a fresh coat of white lead paste so thick it could crack like plaster was pressed over her face, sealing in the sores, the broken capillaries, the raw wounds that leaked beneath. With every passing year, the mask grew heavier, colder, more suffocating, until her real skin was no longer skin at all, but a patchwork of irritated flesh, rashes, and weeping ulcers that never had the chance to heal. The air around her smelled faintly of vinegar, metal, and something darker, something that forced even the bravest courtier to breathe shallowly. But the face was only the beginning. Inside her mouth, an entirely different kind of horror was unfolding. The queen who once smiled with luminous teeth now carried a ruin behind her lips, teeth rotted black, some worn to stumps, others gone completely. Her love of sugar and indulgence, rare and luxurious in her time, mixed with the absence of any true dental care, had created a battlefield of infection. She stuffed cloth inside her cheeks to keep her face appearing full, hiding the sunken collapse that comes when teeth disappear from their posts. Diplomats wrote cautiously about unpleasant breath, but in truth it was a stench so overpowering that seasoned ambassadors instinctively stepped back to avoid gagging before the throne. Her court obeyed the illusion because obedience was survival. They bowed deeply, not out of courtesy, but to avoid meeting her eyes and seeing the pain behind them. By the time she entered her 70s, Elizabeth's collapse was no longer just physical. Her mind, once the sharpest in Europe, began cracking like the dried layers of makeup on her skin. Night after night, she wandered her chambers, hearing voices that were not there, answering whispers only she could hear. She refused to sleep, terrified of the visions waiting behind her eyelids. She spoke to her long-dead father Henry, to her sister Mary, to her mother Anne Boleyn, as if they were standing beside her bed. The line between memory and hallucination, between the living and the dead, thinned until it vanished. Richmond Palace, once a glittering symbol of royal magnificence, became a mausoleum. Heavy curtains trapped the stale air of sickness. Perfumed smoke smoldered constantly to fight the stench of infection. Every sunrise forced her attendants to scrub away the night's seepage from her sores before rebuilding the mask she needed to face the world. It was not a morning routine. It was embalming the living. The horror grew crueler. Elizabeth, exhausted beyond measure, refused to lie in her bed. Instead, she sat motionless for days on a mound of cushions like a decaying statue, refusing food, refusing rest, refusing even the touch of those who tried to help her. Her ladies' people who had loved her for decades could do nothing but watch as she slipped further into a twilight world between sanity and delirium. Some swore she no longer feared death. She only feared being seen, and on the final days, she was. Her refusal of cosmetics revealed the face she had hidden for decades, mottled gray skin stretched tight over bone, lips cracked and dry, facial structure collapsed where teeth had long since vanished, hair sparse and dull. Those who saw her never forgot. Those who didn't were grateful they had been spared. When she finally exhaled her last breath, the court moved quickly, not out of reverence but out of fear. They rushed to restore the illusion one final time. They bathed her corpse in oils, repainted her dead face with the same white lead that had ruined her living one, arranged her thinning hair into the style the world remembered, dressed her in brilliant robes that concealed the wasting beneath. They laid her out not as she truly was, but as she had forced herself to appear for so many years, perfect, eternal, untouchable. The world saw the immaculate queen in her coffin, serene and majestic. But the truth, the real truth, was sealed beneath that final mask, beneath the layers of poison that had consumed her inch by inch. It was the truth her portraits never showed, that her courtiers never dared whisper, that her body carried silently until the end. And that is the story this series uncovers: the body that decayed, the mind that shattered, the mask that deceived a kingdom, and the woman who chose agony over authenticity because the crown demanded it. The truth of her unraveling does not begin with the moment she died, or even with the final winter when she refused her bed. It begins in the quiet terror of her private chambers decades earlier. At the very moment when the mask first fused itself to her skin and the nightmare slowly rooted inside her. In those years, long before the court understood anything was wrong, the signs were already blooming in the fine cracks around her eyes and the faint tremble in her jaw when she smiled for too long. Warnings so small they could be mistaken for fatigue after a long council or the weariness that comes from ruling a kingdom divided by faith. But to the women closest to her, the ones who dressed her, undressed her, and saw her between the seams of the image she showed the world, those early changes carried a darker note, the kind that made them hold their breath a fraction longer when they lifted the white lead jar, knowing each application carved a little more life out of the woman they served. They could never say it aloud. No one dared, but they felt it. The way her skin resisted their touch, the way it seemed to flake beneath their fingers like old parchment, the way her lips began to bleed when she smiled too wide. They painted her anyway. The crown required it. She required it. She had become her own sculptor and her own prisoner. Each morning the ritual grew heavier, consuming hours that stretched out like threads being pulled from the fabric of her human self. First, the cold water to wash the remnants of the previous day's mask. Then the vinegar-soaked cloth that stung her open sores until her jaw clenched and her breath shook. Then the thick paste of white lead, pressed carefully into place as if molding clay over bone. Her ladies worked with the tenderness of surgeons, but also with the dread of soldiers patching armor that would be shattered again by nightfall. They learned how to avoid the patches where the skin tore most easily, how to soothe the blistered spots with herbal oil that barely dulled the sting, how to pretend not to notice when the queen winced or when a bead of blood appeared and had to be wiped away before it seeped into the pale mask. They knew that beneath every coat of paint was another wound that would deepen the next day, another scar that would need covering, another piece of her human face erased forever. What she endured in silence during these mornings was a kind of quiet war no one will ever fully understand. She did not cry out. She did not ask for gentler hands or fewer layers. She lifted her chin, motioned for more powder when her skin threatened to show through, refused every suggestion that perhaps they could use less today, refused to meet their eyes because she knew pity when she heard it breathing in the room. They admired her then, even as they feared what they were helping her become. They watched her sit still for hours, still as death, while the mask hardened over her features, giving her the ageless smoothness the world expected. And every day, when the final stroke of vermilion stained her lips, they saw the transformation, complete queen on the outside, suffering flesh beneath, the two realities forever locked in battle. But the torment did not end with the morning ritual. The afternoon brought another kind of cruelty, one that no paint could soften. Her teeth, weak from years of sugar and years of pain she refused to name, began to throb with a pulse that matched her heartbeat. Sometimes she pressed her fingertips against her jawline, as if trying to silence the pain by force, her breath catching when a wave of heat surged up her face. She would dismiss half the court on those days, retreating into private councils to speak as little as possible, choosing words that did not require her tongue to brush too sharply against the ruined ridges inside her mouth. She knew her voice was changing, that the smooth clarity she once wielded like a blade was slipping away, replaced by the faint lisp of a woman losing the architecture of her own mouth. She hated it. She fought it. She ordered more cloth to be prepared so she could fill the hollow places before every audience, creating the illusion of a full, unbroken jaw, even as the fabric soaked the taste of infection. Her nights were worse. Pain is a thing that spreads when the world grows quiet, and in the darkness of her chambers, the agony in her teeth, the burning in her skin, the strange pressure behind her eyes became a single monstrous presence that crawled through her veins. She paced to outrun it, pacing until her feet swelled and her gowns dragged heavily behind her. She paced until she saw shadows move in the corners, until the flicker of the candles twisted into shapes that made her heart thud violently. More than once, her ladies found her gripping the bedpost at dawn, fingers white, face ashen beneath the powder, insisting she had heard someone whisper her name from the far end of the room. They told her it was the settling of wood, the sigh of wind under the doors, the murmur of servants outside. She knew they were lying. She knew the voices had spoken from inside her mind, but admitting that felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff. The worst moments came when she tried to sleep. The pain in her jaw radiated into her skull. The burning from the lead crawled across her cheeks. The tremors from mercury pulsed in her hands. And the nightmares, rich, vivid, suffocating nightmares, descended with the weight of a hand pressed over her face. She saw her father in those dreams. Not the king of her childhood, but a towering figure with judgment in his eyes. She saw her mother reaching for her with hands stained in blood. She saw her sister Mary whispering accusations. She woke drenched in a cold sweat that stung every open sore, gasping for breath, reaching for a candle to prove the world was still real. Some nights she awoke screaming, but the sound never left her throat. It stayed trapped somewhere deep, swallowed by the fear of letting anyone hear how desperately human she had become. In the daylight, she tried to hide the trembling in her hands by folding them elegantly in her lap. She hid the pain behind speeches that were shorter now, her voice lower, the words chosen for ease rather than effect. She dismissed mirrors, claiming they distracted her, but in truth she could no longer withstand the sight of her own reflection, the way her face seemed to sag beneath the weight of the mask, the way the powder cracked when she smiled. She knew that beneath the white paint her true skin was becoming something unrecognizable, something she feared might mark her not as queen but as monster. And yet she endured it. She endured every stab of pain, every hallucination that whispered her name, every moment her skin peeled under the wipe of a cloth, because she believed the kingdom needed her to remain perfect, untouchable, eternal. She believed that her people would crumble if they saw her crumble first. She held her crown with hands that trembled and teeth that throbbed, and a face that felt as though it were dissolving beneath the poison she wore like armor. She could have stopped. She could have chosen to let herself age naturally, to show the truth of what time does to flesh. But for Elizabeth, the truth was a danger greater than any foreign army. So she chose the mask again and again and again, until the mask fused to her very existence. And that is where her nightmare deepened, in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, when the woman beneath the crown realized she was no longer battling her enemies or her court or even the expectations of her people, but her own reflection, her own bones, her own dying body. A war she could not win, yet refused to surrender. The decay was no longer something she hid. It was something she lived within, a prison built by her own hand, disguised by beauty, sustained by fear, and fed by the poison she had once believed was her salvation. The slow descent into the deeper layers of her torment began in ways no one at court could immediately name, a creeping distortion of sensation that settled first in the edges of her awareness before blooming into something far more sinister. It started with a faint spinning when she stood too quickly, a soft buzzing at the base of her skull that she dismissed as fatigue. Then a strange metallic taste that lingered at the back of her tongue, no matter how much wine she sipped or how many sugared fruits she consumed. She would pause mid-sentence, fingers tightening on the arm of her chair as a ripple of dizziness washed through her. But she forced herself to continue speaking, forced her breath to steady, forced the world to see nothing but the queen who never faltered. Yet her body was whispering truths she was not ready to hear. Truths that would soon roar loud enough to drown out reason. Each time the dizziness returned, it brought with it an echo of shame, a sense that her own flesh was disobeying her commands, betraying her in front of eyes always watching for weakness. So she trained herself to rise more slowly, to move with deliberate grace, to lean discreetly on a table or the shoulder of a courtier if the floor began to tilt beneath her. But the dizzy spells came more often, and with them came something far more alarming, the sense that time was slipping, folding, repeating itself. She began to notice that certain conversations felt too familiar, as though she had already spoken the words a day earlier, or perhaps only imagined them in one of her sleepless wanderings. There were mornings when her ladies greeted her, and she stared at them blankly because for a heartbeat she did not recognize their faces. Not from age, but from a strange fog that layered itself between her and reality. She would blink hard, force their names to return, and they always did, but not quickly enough to erase the cold stab of fear that bloomed in her chest when memory hesitated. Her world was becoming unreliable, as though threads were loosening from the tapestry of her mind and drifting out of reach. Yet she clung to routine, like a rope pulled taut over an abyss. If she could follow her schedule flawlessly, if she could conduct councils, sign documents, greet ambassadors, then perhaps she could convince herself that the missing fragments were meaningless, that the shadows in her mind were temporary. But her body continued its rebellion. The tremors in her hands, once subtle enough to hide by clasping them at her waist, grew more insistent, trembling through her fingers even as she sat still. When the tremors reached her right hand, her writing hand, she tried to disguise the shaky script by claiming poor lighting, exhaustion, cold air, anything but the truth that her nerves were fraying like the edges of a worn tapestry. She began to dictate letters instead of writing them, her voice measured and slow to prevent the tremor from slipping into her speech. Some days she succeeded, but on others, her tongue felt heavy, and she bit the inside of her cheek to ground herself, tasting blood but forcing her voice to remain steady. Her vision, once sharp enough to read long scrolls by candlelight, began to blur at the edges. She found herself squinting, bringing documents closer until her nose nearly brushed the parchment. At first she blamed age, then she blamed sleepless nights. But deep down she feared the truth that the belladonna drops she chased beauty with had finally begun to demand their price. Her pupils dilated too widely, letting in more light than her eyes could bear, turning the world into a haze of brightness that stabbed at her temples. In dim rooms she saw halos around candles. In bright ones she saw double. Shapes blurred into one another, and faces shifted when she tried to focus, forcing her to rely on tone rather than expression. Her world was becoming a place of smear and shimmer, a world where she could no longer trust what her eyes offered her. Her nights became battlegrounds where her mind strained to navigate between waking and dreaming. She would lie down only to immediately sit up, convinced the mattress was sinking into the floor or that unseen hands were tugging at her sleeves. Sometimes she felt as though someone stood behind her, breathing softly against her neck. But when she turned, the chamber was empty except for the silent flicker of candles. Other nights she would startle awake with the certainty that someone had whispered her name in her ear. The sound so real she would clutch the bedding and demand the guards search the room. They always found nothing, but the nothingness only deepened her fear. Pain threaded itself through this confusion, dull aches that settled in her bones, sharp spikes that shot through her jaw, burning sensations that crawled across her cheeks like invisible insects. She scratched at her skin in her sleep, waking to find streaks of dried blood on her pillow. Her ladies pleaded gently with her to keep her hands folded at night, but the itch was unbearable, a restless fire beneath her flesh that made her feel trapped inside her own body. To soothe her, they brought bowls of cool water, pressed cloths against her face, whispered calming words as if she were a frightened child instead of the most powerful woman in England. She hated their pity, but she needed their presence, because being alone meant facing the truth that her body no longer felt like her own. She began to mistrust her senses entirely. A distant footstep might sound like thunder. A soft whisper might swell into a shout. The flickering of candlelight at night formed shapes that seemed to crawl across the walls. She knew they were illusions, at least she thought she knew, but knowing did not stop her heart from pounding or her breath from catching in her throat. She felt hunted by something she could not name, something living inside her just beneath the threshold of understanding. She sensed it in the hollow of her stomach, in the pounding of her heart, in the moments when the world went quiet, and she could hear her own blood rushing in her ears like a warning drum. Some mornings, when her ladies lifted the curtains, they found her sitting on the edge of her bed with her eyes open but unfocused, as though she had been awake the entire night watching something only she could see. They would speak her name, and she would blink and return to herself slowly, as if surfacing through deep water. She never admitted what visions had occupied her, but her silence told them everything. They saw the fear that lingered in her gaze before she masked it with regal control. This was the part of her suffering no one in the kingdom ever saw. The unraveling that happened in the privacy of her chambers, the crumbling logic, the shifting senses, the memories that slipped away like smoke through her fingers. And she fought it relentlessly, gripping her identity with a force of will that would have broken most souls. She forced herself to attend council meetings even when her head throbbed, and the voices of her advisors blurred into a single echoing rumble. She forced herself to greet ambassadors even when her vision doubled their faces and her jaw trembled with every word. She forced herself to keep the rituals of state even when her mind drifted and she had to silently rehearse her own name just to steady herself. The tragedy of it all lay in the quiet truth she refused to speak. She was fighting not an invader, not a conspiracy, not a foreign army, but her own mind slipping through the cracks created by years of poison and exhaustion. She could command countries, but she could not command her own nerves, her own senses, her own trembling body, and yet she refused to yield. Every morning she rose, allowed the mask to be rebuilt, and stepped into the role the world demanded of her, even as the woman beneath that role was dissolving, losing shape like a shadow in failing light. The war inside her grew more violent with each passing day, but she carried it alone, carrying also the terrible knowledge that queens are allowed to show strength and fury, but never fragility, never fear. She hid it all behind the mask because she believed England itself would collapse if she let the mask fall. Her unraveling deepened in ways that no ritual, no counsel, no carefully arranged appearance could disguise, because the poison that had begun with her skin and spread to her senses was now burrowing into the deepest corridors of her body, attacking her from within like a silent army that knew every weakness she possessed. It crept first into her throat, tightening it at odd hours, making her swallow again and again as though something unseen were lodged there. Then it moved lower, curling into her chest with a heat that made her gasp for air in the middle of the night, clutching the neckline of her gown as if it were choking her. Her ladies would rush to her bedside, their faces pale in the candlelight, and they would rub her back, whispering that it was only nerves, only exhaustion. But she knew better. She could feel the heat spreading, spiraling through her ribs, wrapping around her lungs with fingers that seemed almost sentient. It left her breath short during audiences, her voice thinner, her posture stiffer as though her entire body were an elaborate costume she struggled to hold upright. And then came the deeper pains, the ones that settled in her abdomen like knots pulled tight and refusing to loosen. Some days she could ignore them, pressing her lips together and pacing through her routine with the determination of someone marching toward a battlefield. Other days the pain struck so sharply she had to grip the edge of a table or wall, waiting for the wave to pass. She never cried out. Crying out meant acknowledging weakness, and Elizabeth had spent her entire life learning how to swallow every fear, every tremor, every failing. Her ladies would sometimes find her standing alone, perfectly still, as though posing for a portrait, but her knuckles white, her breath held, her eyes fixed on a point only she could see, while the pain coiled inside her like a living thing. She would dismiss them with a flick of her fingers, but the truth hovered in the room long after her body was losing the quiet wars she kept hidden from the world. The infections that had begun in her mouth spread inward, slow and relentless. On some mornings her face was swollen on one side, a dull red puffiness beneath the layers of powder that her ladies desperately tried to conceal. She could feel the pressure pulsing beneath her jaw, throbbing in a way that made the entire left side of her face feel foreign. The abscesses opened at night sometimes, leaking pus that stained her pillows, leaving her shivering with fever that no amount of blankets could soothe. She would sit upright for hours, clutching her chest, tasting the bitterness of the infection rising into her throat. When dawn came, she insisted on beginning the day as usual, commanding her ladies to paint the mask over skin still warm with the remnants of fever. They worked quickly, their hands careful, terrified of pressing too hard on the swollen places. They could smell at the rot, the sourness, the lingering scent of sickness that clung to her as stubbornly as her determination to pretend she was still whole. Her hands began to betray her next. The skin on her fingers thinned until it tore easily, leaving tiny wounds that refused to heal. The lead paste she used on her face had seeped into her blood through the years, and now it attacked her from beneath her fingernails, weakening them until they cracked and bled even when she simply lifted a teacup. She hid her hands in gloves whenever possible, but gloves could not disguise the shaking, nor could they hide the dark blue tint that sometimes stained the edges of her nails, a sign of the poison that had long begun its quiet occupation of her bloodstream. She rubbed her hands frequently, sometimes not even realizing she was doing it, as though trying to rub life back into them, as though she could coax them into remembering the strength they once had. Her legs grew weak. At first she stumbled only rarely, catching herself with a graceful motion that made it seem intentional. But soon the weakness became more pronounced, forcing her to lean subtly against chairs or walls as she moved. She summoned her musicians less frequently because standing to dance became a task too painful, too revealing. When she did attempt it, her knees wobbled in ways she couldn't disguise, the music blurring as her vision swirled. She would wave the musicians away with a light-hearted joke, but as soon as she turned, her mouth tightened in a grim line, and her ladies rushed to steady her without appearing to do so. She once ruled ballrooms. Now she struggled to rule her own limbs. The deterioration spread upward as well. Her neck stiffened until turning her head became a small agony, and she compensated by turning her entire torso instead, moving slowly and deliberately like a statue being rotated by invisible hands. Her spine ached constantly, a dull, throbbing pain that worsened whenever she sat for long periods during council meetings. She shifted often in her chair, though always with regal restraint, refusing to allow the watching world to perceive her discomfort. But her ladies saw how she touched her lower back when she thought no one was looking, how she winced when rising from her seat, how she sometimes braced herself with a hand pressing against her thigh to force her body to obey her. Her breathing changed, too. Infections left her chest tight, forcing her to take shallow breaths that made her voice flutter at the ends of sentences. On particularly difficult days, she struggled to disguise the way she inhaled sharply mid-speech, hiding the rising panic with a soft cough or a carefully placed pause as though she were merely contemplating her next words. But her ladies heard the truth late at night when the castle grew silent, her coughs muffled beneath blankets, her gasping breaths echoing faintly against stone walls as she fought to draw enough air into lungs that felt clenched by an invisible hand. The physical torments fed the mental ones. On days when her body hurt too deeply to ignore, her thoughts drifted more easily into dark places. She began to misplace objects, rings, letters, hairpins, looking for them in the wrong rooms, or forgetting she had given them to someone hours earlier. She grew suspicious of her ladies when they tried to remind her where she had put things, snapping at them, her voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. Sometimes she accused them of stealing, only to apologize later with a tremulous whisper that was far more frightening than the accusation had been. She no longer trusted her own memory, and that terror bled into everything she did. During council meetings, she found herself staring at maps without seeing them, listening to advisors without hearing them. She asked questions that had already been answered, repeated concerns she had addressed the previous day, and dismissed attendants only to summon them again moments later with the same request. Her counselors exchanged uneasy glances behind her back, but none dared speak of it openly. A queen's mind was not allowed to fail, yet even they could not ignore the growing pauses in her speech. The strange way she sometimes fell silent mid-thought, as though her mind had wandered down a hallway she could not find her way out of. The isolation grew thicker. She withdrew not because she wished to, but because she feared that every flicker of weakness was a chisel against her crown. Days passed when she refused to hold audiences, claiming fatigue or weather. But her ladies saw what truly held her back, the red patches blooming on her cheeks beneath the powder, the swelling in her jawline, the trembling in her lips. She would sit before her mirrorless vanity, she had already banned mirrors long ago, and ask for more powder, more vermilion, more fabric for her cheeks, as though if the mask were thick enough, it could also mend her failing body beneath. But the body that had carried her through wars, rebellions, epidemics, betrayals, and loss was collapsing inward. The poison she wore daily, the infections she ignored, the exhaustion she swallowed like medicine, all of it was converging now, turning her flesh into a battlefield where she fought alone. The slow death was already underway. Not a moment, but a process. A quiet sinking, a gradual drowning beneath the weight of pain that never let her rest. And she bore it all with the silent fury of a woman determined to remain queen until her last breath. Even as the woman beneath the crown slowly disappeared, piece by fragile piece, into the shadows of her own failing form. The deeper the sickness burrowed into her, the more the nights became the true stage of her suffering, because in the daylight she could still command the illusion, could still sit beneath her crown and straighten her spine and shape her voice into something resembling control. But when darkness crept into the corners of her chambers and the candles began their restless flickering, the woman beneath the title could no longer pretend she was whole. It always began quietly, with a strange humming sound in her ears that rose and fell like distant chanting, and she would press her palms against the sides of her head, hoping to silence it before the rest of the night's torments descended. But the humming always grew louder. It vibrated through her skull, rattling her thoughts, making it impossible to focus on anything except the growing sense that her mind was slipping through her fingers like sand she could not gather fast enough. She would sit upright, shoulders tense, breathing shallow, waiting for the next assault. The pains in her body seemed to conspire with the unraveling of her mind, rising as soon as the world around her fell quiet. Her jaw pulsed in heavy waves, each throb echoing through her temples, while the infection deep within her mouth burned with a heat that felt almost alive. She pressed her fingers against her cheeks to relieve the pressure, but even the slightest touch sent sharp jolts racing through her nerves, making her flinch at her own hands. She tasted metal constantly, a bitter tang that coated her tongue, mingled with the scent of decay she could no longer fully mask. Sometimes she tried to sleep sitting upright, believing the pain would ease if she did not lie down. But the moment her eyes closed, her heart began to race, and she felt as though the air in the room were thinning, leaving her gasping and clawing at her own throat, desperate for breath that seemed to retreat from her. In these hours, her mind betrayed her most cruelly. Thoughts slipped into one another, losing their shape, turning into fragments that dissolved before she could grasp them. She would begin a sentence, only to forget what she meant to say halfway through, staring into space as though searching for words that had fallen out of reach. Sometimes she whispered to herself, trying to anchor her thoughts with the sound of her own voice, but even that betrayed her, trembling and breathless, sounding older and more fragile than she ever allowed anyone to hear. She feared that if she spoke too loudly, the walls themselves might hear how broken she had become, and then the shadows would move. At first, it was only the flickering of candlelight stretching along the stone, harmless in its shifting shapes. But as her vision blurred, As the poison tightened its grip, the shadows took on forms that made her heart hammer painfully. She saw tall silhouettes leaning toward her, faces forming where none existed, mouths opening though no sound emerged. She blinked hard, telling herself it was only her tired eyes, but they remained, lingering at the edge of her vision, slipping behind curtains, gliding along the far wall, making the darkness seem thick and heavy with presence. She refused to call her ladies, because she feared their eyes would confirm what she saw, and the thought of someone else witnessing the creatures her mind conjured was more terrifying than facing them alone. Her sense of time fractured in these nights. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into moments she could not remember. Some nights she sat on the cold floor, her back pressed against the bed frame, fingers trembling violently, waiting for dawn as though it were a rescuer that always arrived too late. Other nights she wandered her chambers in silence, touching the tapestries with her fingertips, tracing the embroidered figures like a blind woman trying to remember the world she once walked confidently through. Her breathing became a metronome of fear, quick and uneven, echoing softly between stone walls that once knew her strength and now bore witness to her collapse. And always, always, the voices returned. They began as murmurs, small whispers she could dismiss as echoes in the hall or restless servants outside her door. But slowly they sharpened, took on tones she recognized, voices she had heard decades before. Sometimes it was Mary's stern voice, calling her name in the cold, tight way she remembered from her youth. Sometimes it was the low, commanding timbre of Henry, echoing through her skull like a reprimand. But the one that unmade her completely was her mother's. She heard Anne's voice with a clarity that made her entire body go still, a soft, pained whisper that called to her from somewhere deep within the darkness. It was impossible. She knew that, and yet the voice was there, and it filled her with a desperate longing so fierce she nearly reached out into the shadows as though a hand might reach back. These nights left her exhausted, trembling by morning, but she insisted on her rituals anyway. Her ladies found her pale and wide-eyed, sitting rigidly on the edge of her bed or still draped in the gown she had worn the night before, fingers frozen around the fabric as though she had been clutching it for hours. They spoke softly to her, trying to calm her, but she snapped at them more now, her nerves frayed to threads. The smallest sound startled her. A candle sputtering made her jerk. The rustle of skirts behind her made her spin so quickly her vision blurred and she had to grip a table to steady herself. The ladies exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed her commands, preparing her powders, her lead paste, her vermilion, building the mask over a face that carried the exhaustion of endless nights spent fighting an invisible enemy. Her days lacked rest, her nights lacked peace, and the constant strain made her temper unpredictable. She lashed out at her counselors without reason, accusing them of incompetence, disloyalty, plots that existed only in the feverish corners of her mind. She dismissed servants abruptly, then demanded their return as though she had forgotten her outbursts. She paced during meetings, her breath coming too fast, her words jumping from topic to topic without order. Sometimes she forgot which documents she had signed, which ambassadors she had spoken to, which edicts she had issued. The confusion frightened her so deeply that she doubled down on control, issuing commands with icy precision, correcting minor mistakes with vicious intensity, because losing control of others felt easier than admitting she was losing control of herself. Food repulsed her. The infection in her mouth made chewing agony, and the constant nausea from her fevers left her unable to force down more than a few mouthfuls. Her gowns began to hang loosely from her shoulders, and she had her ladies pad the bodice more carefully, adding layers beneath the fabric so no one would see how much weight she had lost. They brushed her hair gently, but half of it came away in their hands, leaving her scalp tender and raw. They replaced her natural hair with wigs, arranging them with meticulous care to hide the thinning strands beneath. She watched them in silence, her eyes hollow, her breath shallow, and when they tried to comfort her with soft murmurs, she looked at them with a sharpness that made them recoil, as though comfort itself had become an unforgivable insult. The loneliness intensified. She no longer trusted the world outside her chambers. She no longer trusted her body. She no longer trusted her mind. Some nights she sat in her chair, fingers gripping the armrest so tightly they shook, staring into the dark as if daring it to swallow her. Other nights she whispered to herself just to hear a human voice, trying to remember the sound of sanity. Her suffering became a ritual she endured in silence, a nightly communion with the unraveling of her own existence. And the weight of it pressed deeper and deeper into her until she felt hollowed, emptied out, and yet somehow still suffocating. But she did not break. She refused to break. She held on with the stubborn, desperate resolve of someone who believed that if she surrendered even once, even for a moment, the collapse would be total and irreversible. She fought her body. She fought her mind. She fought the shadows and the voices and the pain. And every morning she rose with shaking limbs and forced the world to see only the mask she chose. Yet the truth, raw, dark, merciless, was becoming impossible to contain. Her body was folding under the weight of poison, her mind slipping through unseen cracks, her nights turning into a labyrinth she could not escape. And the world outside her chambers had only begun to sense that the queen behind the crown was living through a nightmare she could no longer keep buried beneath paint and silk. The collapse of her body and mind pressed further inward, until even the hours of daylight became battlegrounds she could not navigate without feeling the weight of something unseen crawling along her bones. And the palace around her seemed to sense the shift, as if the very walls understood that the queen who once commanded storms was now barely holding herself together. The air in her chambers thickened with the scent of illness, a mixture of metal and decay that no burning herbs or perfumed oils could chase away. And her ladies moved through the space with the careful silence of women tending to a shrine already half claimed by death. Yet she refused to acknowledge any of it, rising each morning with the rigid determination of someone who believes that standing upright is the only thing keeping the world from crumbling. She sat before her vanity even when her vision blurred so badly she could not see the hands painting her face, allowing the mask to be rebuilt because without it she feared she would vanish, dissolving like smoke into the morning light. Her skin had become a map of wounds that never fully healed, patches of angry red beneath the white paste, streaks of yellowed fluid that her ladies wiped away with trembling fingers, praying she did not feel the sting, but she always felt it. Her jaw tightened, her breath hitched, and though her expression remained mostly composed, there were moments, small, fleeting moments when her eyes fluttered shut from the pain, as if she were fighting the instinct to flee from her own reflection. Yet she never allowed the pain to sway her resolve. She leaned forward slightly, offering her face to the next layer of poison, because the mask was no longer just a disguise. It had become the armor she needed to survive the gaze of a world that demanded strength she no longer possessed. But the decay beneath the surface had begun to spill into places even the mask could not hide. Her throat swelled at times, stiff and tender, making every swallow feel like dragging a blade through raw tissue. Her chest tightened in a way that made her breath sound wet and uneven, a soft rattle she tried to smother beneath controlled inhales. The counselors seated closest to her sometimes heard it and shifted uncomfortably, pretending it was only the rustle of her gown. They avoided looking at her too long, afraid of seeing too clearly how much of her was slipping away. During audiences, she sat as still as she could, though stillness had become a burden her body resisted. Pain lanced through her spine when she sat too long, radiating down her hips and into her legs until she had to press her feet firmly into the floor just to stay upright. Sometimes her foot tapped uncontrollably, a small tremor she hid by tucking her skirts around her ankle. Her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap, not out of elegance but necessity, because if she let them rest freely, they would twitch and tremble in ways she could not control. She had mastered the art of hiding her breath too, releasing it slowly through her nose so that none would hear how shallow it had become, how each inhale was a struggle and each exhale a prayer that her lungs would continue cooperating for one more hour. Then came the days when she could no longer pretend the pain was manageable. A burning heat settled deep in her lower abdomen, a twisting agony that flared without warning, stopping her mid-step and forcing her to grasp the nearest surface with white knuckles. She clenched her teeth against it, though even that hurt, the pressure sending a spike of pain through her decayed jaw. She excused herself abruptly from meetings, claiming matters of urgency, though the urgency was not political but purely physical, a desperate need to be away from the eyes of the court when the pain rendered her too human for comfort. In the privacy of her chambers, she sometimes doubled over, gasping for breath, gripping the edge of her bed so tightly her nails split and bled. Her ladies hovered helplessly, offering cool claws and whispered comfort she refused to accept, waving them away with a trembling hand, even as her body shook. Her appetite dwindled further. Some days she managed only sips of broth. On others, she forced down small bites of soft bread, chewing gingerly to avoid the agony of her infected gums. Her once favorite sweets now made her nauseous, the very thought of sugar sending a sour taste to the back of her throat. Her weight dropped quickly. Dresses that once fit her form perfectly now hung loose at the shoulders and hips, and her ladies worked tirelessly to alter them, adding padding beneath the bodice to disguise the thinning frame. She watched them do this with an expression that hovered between weariness and resignation, never acknowledging the transformation, but always sensing it, like a distant echo of a truth she refused to let touch her. Walking became an ordeal. Her knees ached constantly, grinding as though the joints were rusting. Her steps, once sharp and decisive, grew slower, more deliberate, each one taken with the calculation of someone gauging how much their body might betray them. She used furniture to steady herself, though always subtly, gliding a hand across a table or letting her fingertips brush a wall as she passed. When stepping down from her dais, she gripped the edge of it lightly, under the pretense of adjusting her gown. But in truth, it was the only way to ensure she did not stumble in full view of her court. She refused help even when she clearly needed it, brushing off offered arms with a look that brooked no argument. The pride that had held her throne for decades now held her upright even when her body begged for rest. Her sleep deteriorated further, becoming a fractured mosaic of restless moments and shallow breaths. Even when she managed to drift into unconsciousness, her dreams twisted into nightmares where the walls closed in or the floor sank beneath her feet. Sometimes she dreamed she was falling through an endless darkness, her crown slipping from her head, her mask cracking, her face melting away to reveal nothing beneath. She woke from these dreams drenched in sweat, her nightgown clinging to her trembling body, her breath fast and shallow. She would lie awake for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling, terrified of closing her eyes again. Her ladies found her increasingly difficult to soothe. She recoiled from touch, even gentle touch, as though her skin itself had become raw. When they tried to bathe her, she often resisted, flinching when the water touched her open sores. They washed her as carefully as they could, dabbing instead of scrubbing, their hands gentle but trembling with fear that a single wrong motion might tear her skin. She rarely spoke during these moments, her silence heavy with humiliation and exhaustion. She endured the cleansing like a ritual she had no strength to protest, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the room, beyond the pain, beyond the body that no longer felt like hers. The infections in her body left her feverish more often now. Heat radiated off her skin, and her breathing grew shallow, rasping. Her ladies placed cool cloths on her forehead, her wrists, the back of her neck, but the relief was fleeting. She shivered violently even as sweat soaked her linens, her body caught in the cruel grip of warring temperatures. Sometimes she muttered incoherently through the fever, speaking to people who were no longer alive, reaching out for hands that were not there. Her ladies listened with dread as she whispered apologies, confessions, fears she had buried for decades, the fever loosening her iron grip on silence. Her counsel became increasingly concerned about her absences. Letters piled up unanswered. Ambassadors waited for hours only to be told the Queen could not receive them. Rumors began to circulate, soft at first, like murmurs carried by the wind. then louder as the weeks passed. Some said she was grieving, others whispered she was ill. A few dared to suggest she was losing her mind. Those closest to her denied everything, insisting the queen was merely tired. That age came for all, even monarchs, but the truth weighed heavily on them. They had seen her at dawn, trembling and pale, stumbling as she tried to dress, her breath wheezing through her weakened chest. They knew the facade was thinning, stretched nearly to breaking, yet she clung to the last threads of her identity with a fierceness that defied reason. Even on days when her body felt carved from pain, when her mind drifted like a ship caught in fog, she demanded her robes, her jewels, her crown. She sat in her presence chamber alone, dressed in full regalia, as if the very particles of air around her would remember her strength if she repeated the ritual enough times. She refused to be seen undone. She refused to surrender to the decay she could feel pressing inward like encroaching darkness. But the truth was spreading, not only through her bloodstream but through the halls of her palace, through the whispers of her servants, through the heavy silences of her council. And though she hid it with every ounce of her will, the kingdom was beginning to sense that its queen, its symbol of endurance and power, was living inside a body that had begun to collapse beyond the reach of pride, paint, and prayer. The boundaries that once separated her suffering from the world around her continued to thin until her chambers no longer felt like rooms, but like a living organism breathing with her, tightening around her whenever her body faltered, expanding whenever her mind drifted into one of the strange, frightening places it now wandered without warning. The tapestries on the walls, once vibrant with scenes of triumph and myth, began to feel like silent witnesses to her decline, their embroidered figures watching her with stitched eyes that never blinked. The flickering flames of the candles cast uneasy shadows that stretched and twisted across the stone, as though the room itself were exhaling with her, inhaling with her, trembling with her. Every corner felt too close, every window too narrow, every doorway too distant, and she found herself shrinking away from her own surroundings, retreating into the smallest spaces where she could sit, curled inward, clutching her arms around her as if to hold herself together before she fell apart entirely. Her ladies noticed how she gravitated toward the darker parts of the chamber, away from the sunlight that once energized her, and toward the dim recesses where she could hide her trembling hands beneath the folds of her gown. When they entered with fresh linens or trays of food, she would turn her head slightly away, not because she wished to avoid them, but because the light stung her eyes now, burning through the layers of belladonna residue and age that had weakened her vision. Sometimes she shielded her eyes with her hand, her fingers shaking, whispering that the sun was too sharp today, or that it was too bright for someone who had not slept. The shadows had become her refuge. In the shadows, the pressure behind her eyes eased. The room stopped spinning. The trembling in her legs felt less noticeable. She could breathe without feeling as though the air were piercing her lungs. But the shadows also whispered, and the form they whispered through was memory. She began to drift in and out of recollection, as though the present were too thin to hold her, sliding instead into moments from decades earlier that replayed in her mind with alarming clarity. She would speak suddenly of her coronation, describing the cold January morning as though it were happening right outside the window. Then she would shift into memories of her imprisonment under her sister's reign, her voice curling with old fear as she described the way the tower walls seemed to lean inward on the nights she believed she would die. Her ladies would listen frozen, unsure whether to comfort her or correct her, because the queen's voice carried a tremor that warned them that breaking the illusion might unravel the fragile thread she was gripping. The memories were not always her own, or at least not always real. There were nights she spoke to the empty room as though addressing someone she could see clearly. She would raise her hand as though beckoning a familiar figure forward, murmuring words that belonged to private conversations long since lost to time. Sometimes she laughed softly, a thin, brittle sound, speaking to what she claimed was her younger self, telling the girl she once was to be brave, to trust her instincts, to ignore the judgments of men who had never understood her. Other nights she pleaded with someone unseen, whispering apologies for things she never voiced aloud, her breath hitching as she confessed sins that her ladies could not decipher through the feverish trembling of her voice. They did not know if she spoke to her mother, her sister, or her own conscience. But they knew enough to remain silent. For these moments belonged to a part of the queen they had never been allowed to see until her body weakened enough to release the secrets she had locked away for a lifetime. Her sense of self unraveled with her memories. She began to lose track of time in the most disarming ways. She asked repeatedly whether she had eaten, even after pushing away untouched plates. She demanded to know when her next audience was hours after canceling it. Sometimes she stood abruptly, insisting she must prepare for a ceremony that had taken place decades earlier, and her ladies had to gently coax her back into her chair, guiding her trembling hands toward the bed without letting her see the fear in their eyes. On one particularly harrowing evening, she insisted on seeing the child she believed she had lost, weeping into her palms when no one answered her cries. Her ladies held her shoulders, shushing her softly, but the queen shook violently in their arms, her tears staining the powder they had so carefully applied minutes earlier. Her physical collapse accelerated with her mental unraveling. The swelling in her face and jaw worsened, sometimes distorting her features so much that even her closest attendants struggled not to recoil. Her breath smelled sharply of infection, thick and cloying, and she turned her head away from anyone who approached too closely, ashamed but unable to endure the tightness in her chest that accompanied every attempt to mask it. She developed chills that made her shudder violently beneath her blankets, teeth chattering against gums that bled with every tremor. Her skin flushed with fever, the heat rising through the multiple layers of her gown until she begged her ladies to remove the fabric from her shoulders, gasping for air, clutching at her neckline as though the weight of silk were suffocating her. They dabbed her forehead with cool cloth that quickly absorbed the heat of her skin, exchanging them again and again while whispering prayers under their breath. But even as her body begged for rest, she refused to surrender to weakness. On mornings when she could barely lift her head, she still demanded her gown, insisting on dressing fully in the richest fabrics and jewels. When she stood to have her robe draped around her shoulders, her legs trembled so violently she nearly collapsed, and her ladies rushed quietly forward, pretending they only wished to adjust the hem or straighten a sleeve. She clung to her dignity with a desperation that frightened even those who loved her most, because it was clear she was forcing her body beyond its limits, refusing to acknowledge she was nearing the end. She sat in her presence chamber, alone for hours, her breath shallow, her spine stiff, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. She stared straight ahead as though willing her image to hold, as though daring anyone to question the strength she no longer possessed. She developed a habit of pacing when the pain became too great to hide, moving slowly back and forth across the chamber like a ghost trapped within the confines of her own life. She dragged her fingertips along the stone walls as she walked, grounding herself through the coolness beneath her skin. She murmured to herself during these pacing spells, her voice barely audible, repeating words that made no sense to her ladies when they pressed their ears to the door. Sometimes she spoke names, sometimes questions, sometimes only fragments of sentences that sounded like pleas made to some unseen presence hovering behind her. When she paused suddenly mid-step and turned her head sharply toward the corner of the room, her ladies felt ice drip down their spines, because they knew she saw something they could not. The physical exhaustion from these spells left her shaking and pale, collapsing into her chair, her breath ragged, her heartbeat thundering beneath her ribs. Yet even then she refused to rest. She pushed aside trays of food, sending them clattering to the floor, insisting she could not afford the weakness of eating. Her ladies tried to persuade her, offering fruits, soft bread, broth, anything to tempt her appetite, but she shook her head sharply, pressing her lips together, as though swallowing even a sip would undo the fragile composure she had managed to force into place. The palace around her began to operate in hushed tones. Servants moved more quietly, counselors met in smaller groups, ambassadors waited longer for audiences that never came. A tension settled over the court like a storm cloud holding back lightning. They all sensed the truth in the shifting air. The queen was dying, slowly, painfully, and no one knew when the end would arrive, or whether she would meet it with clarity or lost fully to the labyrinth of her unraveling mind. Rumors grew, though always behind closed doors, whispers of her inability to speak coherently during brief appearances, whispers of her trembling hands, whispers of the dreadful smell that lingered when she passed. But no one dared speak these rumors aloud, not while she still lived, not while her will still burned beneath the crumbling shell of her body. And through it all, she fought. She fought with every ragged breath, every trembling step, every fevered whisper. She fought to hold on to herself, onto her identity, onto her crown, even as the world around her shifted into something she could no longer fully grasp. The nightmare grew, swallowing her piece by piece, yet she refused to let it take her completely. She clung to the remnants of her strength, even as her mind drifted like a candle flame caught in a draft, flickering, struggling, but refusing to die. Her suffering had become an entire world now, a world she wandered alone, carrying a crown that felt heavier with each passing moment, yet still refusing to let it fall from her head. The weeks that followed folded into one another like layers of heavy, damp cloth. Each day waited with the same oppressive stillness, the same trembling dread, the same unspoken truth that the queen was slipping further away from the world she once commanded with terrifying precision. Every morning her ladies approached her chambers with hesitation, unsure of what state they might find her in, praying softly that she would be lucid, that she would recognize them, that she would speak with the clarity that had once shaped the fate of nations. But more often they found her sitting rigidly upright in the chair she had come to inhabit, like a throne of suffering. Her fingers curled tightly around the armrests, her breath shallow and uneven, her eyes staring ahead with a glassy hollowness that made it impossible to know whether she was awake or caught somewhere between waking and the fevered realm she now drifted into so easily. Her world had become a labyrinth of illusions, and she moved through it as though guided by some instinct that had little to do with the hierarchy of the court or the logic of sovereign rule. She no longer responded immediately when spoken to. Sometimes she did not respond at all. Her ladies would kneel beside her, whispering her name with gentle insistence, and for long moments she remained motionless, her face still beneath the mask of powder, even as her throat trembled with tiny, involuntary spasms. Then without warning, she would turn sharply, her gaze locking onto them with an intensity that made them recoil, because for that moment she seemed entirely present, wholly aware. Her eyes sparked with something like defiance or accusation or fear. They never knew which, but these moments of startling clarity dissolved as quickly as they appeared, washed away by the tide of confusion that returned to claim her. She drifted in and out of sense, sometimes speaking to her ladies as though it were decades earlier, addressing them by names they did not know, giving commands that belonged to battles fought long ago, insisting that certain courtiers be summoned though they had been dead for years. When her ladies tried gently to correct her, she shook her head sharply, as though brushing off cobwebs, insisting she was right, insisting the world around her was wrong. On some days she accused her attendants of lying, her voice rising with a trembling fury that frightened them more than her silence. On others she grew suddenly afraid, grabbing their hands and begging them not to leave her alone, whispering that there were people standing in the room, watching her from behind the tapestries, waiting for her to sleep so they could speak to her again. Nightfall no longer marked a descent, but an engulfment. As shadows deepened and torches were lit along the hallways, she seemed to shrink into herself, her body curling inward as if the darkness pressed on her from all sides. She demanded extra candles, then ordered them extinguished minutes later, claiming the light hurt her eyes or that it created too many shadows that moved without reason. She refused to lie in her bed, insisting the mattress sank into the floor or that someone had hidden beneath the sheets. Instead, she lay on cushions arranged on the floor, as though grounding herself physically might tether her mind to the present. Her ladies sat with her in rotating shifts, whispering soothing words even as they fought to stay awake. Because if they left her alone for even a moment, she would begin murmuring to unseen figures, her voice thin and trembling, carrying fragments of conversations with people who no longer lived. Sometimes she laughed in the dark, a weak, breathless laugh that made her ladies exchange frightened glances, because there was no warmth in the sound, only a kind of bitter acceptance, as though she were laughing at a truth only she could see. Other times she wept quietly, pressing her palms against her eyelids, shaking with sobs she did not try to conceal, keening softly in a way no queen had ever meant to be heard. Her attendants would place hands on her shoulders, but she shrugged them off, insisting she did not want to be touched, insisting their warmth made the pain inside her worse, insisting the slightest movement threatened to open something terrible within her that she could not describe. They backed away, helpless, whispering prayers into the heavy air as she rocked gently on her cushions, whispering to herself or to the ghosts of her memory. Her body continued its collapse with ruthless momentum. The swelling in her limbs grew more severe, her ankles ballooning with fluid that made every step agony. Her joints ached as though ground into dust, each movement producing a faint grating sensation that made her wince. Her breath grew wet and labored, thick with the remnants of infections that had long since spread throughout her body. Some days her ladies could hear a faint rattling in her chest, a sound so delicate yet so terrible that it made the room fall silent every time she inhaled. Her lips cracked until they bled, and even the softest salves caused her to flinch when applied. She drank water in small sips, struggling to swallow, clutching her throat afterward as though the liquid scorched her. Her skin darkened in places, mottled with the ghostly gray hue of lead poisoning and the angry red of inflamed lesions that refused to close. The court grew restless. Servants whispered nervously when they cleaned the hallways. Courtiers gathered in corners, discussing which noble houses seemed poised to rise and which seemed likely to fall once the inevitable occurred. Rumors reached foreign ambassadors, who pressed anxiously for audiences that continued to be postponed. Questions mounted. Why was the queen not seen? Why did her proclamations grow fewer and farther between? Why did the palace seem steeped in a mourning it had not yet been granted permission to express, but no official statement was made? The court held its breath, suspended between the sovereignty they still claimed and the vacuum of power that loomed ever closer. Inside her chambers, the truth grew impossible to disguise. Even her ladies, who had grown numb to the constant shifts in her behavior, now trembled when they approached her chair. They feared the unpredictable twist of her mood, the sudden sharpness of her voice, the hollow stares that lasted too long, the feverish rambling that kept them awake deep into the night. They feared the way her strength seemed to vanish completely, leaving her unable to rise without assistance, unable to stand without swaying, unable to speak without her voice cracking. They feared the coldness that sometimes settled across her skin, an ominous chill that made them exchange quiet glances over her head. Knowing what the coldness might mean, she remained resolute, clinging to the last threads of identity with a determination that bordered on desperation. She insisted on being dressed each morning, even when her body slumped with exhaustion, insisting the layers of silk be draped over her shoulders, the heavy jewels clasped around her neck, the crown positioned carefully upon her thinning hair. She sat upright with sheer force of will, her spine a rigid line of suffering, her hands resting motionless on her lap as though carved from ivory. She stared straight ahead, her breath shallow but steady, her presence a reminder that she still claimed her throne, even as the throne seemed to be claiming her in return. Her final attempts to command reality became rituals marked by trembling hands and fading breath. She summoned her council only to dismiss them moments later, confused by their presence. She requested documents she had already reviewed, scanning them with unfocused eyes before pushing them aside, overwhelmed by words that no longer held shape in her mind. She asked constantly for reports from distant corners of her kingdom, though she struggled to comprehend the answers. And she spoke often now of time, whispering that it felt thinner, shorter, faster, slipping from her grasp no matter how tightly she tried to hold it. The nightmare she lived in had expanded beyond her mind, shaping the world around her. Her chambers, once a place of splendor, had become a tomb in waiting. Not because she was dead, but because she was living in a state where death hovered so closely it seemed to breathe beside her. Every moment became a negotiation with her own collapsing form, a vigil kept by those who loved her, feared her, and mourned her simultaneously. But still she held on. Still she breathed. Still she forced the mask to be applied, layer after layer, hiding the truth even as the truth consumed her from within. Her fight had become the only thing left of her, and though her strength had thinned to a fragile thread, she refused to let it break. Yet the air in the palace had changed. Everyone sensed it. Something was coming, something final, and the queen who once commanded nations was standing on the edge of the last threshold, her body failing, her mind fading, her spirit still burning faintly like a dying candle that flickers desperately before the darkness finally takes its place. The final stretch of her life unfolded not as a series of days, but as one long, trembling exhale. A slow descent into a silence so thick it pressed against the walls of Richmond Palace, like fog rolling in from an unseen sea. Her ladies began to move with a reverence usually reserved for holy spaces, speaking in whispers, stepping lightly, as though any loud sound might shatter the fragile thread of consciousness she clung to. They found her more often than not sitting exactly where they had left her, unmoving, staring at the hearth even when no fire burned there. Her eyes wide and unfocused, the mask of powder dulling in the dim light as though it, too, felt the weight of her decline. Sometimes they spoke her name, gently at first, then louder, but her gaze did not shift, did not blink, did not acknowledge them, and they exchanged frightened glances over her bowed head, certain she was slipping deeper into the place her mind now lingered between waking and the dark. Her limbs had become stiff, the simple act of bending or lifting them an exhausting challenge. When they tried to help her rise, her legs buckled beneath her, and she clutched at their sleeves with cold, shaking fingers, gasping as though the movement alone drained the last of her strength. Her breath came shallow and uneven, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a trembling flutter that seemed too weak to sustain life. She no longer attempted to walk unaided, and even when they guided her carefully from her cushions to her bed, she whimpered beneath her breath, the soft, wounded sound of someone whose body had betrayed her completely. The queen who once rode tirelessly through the countryside, who danced for hours beneath candlelight, now struggled merely to shift her weight from one side to the other. Her voice grew faint, thinning into whispers that her ladies had to lean close to hear, and even then they often caught only fragments, broken sentences, names spoken with fragile urgency. She called out for her mother more frequently now, whispering Anne's name with a desperate longing that cracked her voice into pieces. She asked for Mary, her sister, though whether she sought forgiveness or comfort, none could tell. At times she murmured the names of courtiers long dead, of childhood servants, of tutors who had shaped her mind when she was still sharp, still brilliant, still whole. And sometimes she uttered only sounds, the soft hum of syllables that did not form words, her lips trembling as though she were fighting to hold back the tide of confusion rising within her. Food no longer tempted her. She refused even broth, turning her face away when a spoon neared her lips, her breath hitching at the thought of swallowing. Her ladies tried coaxing, pleading, even commanding her gently in the tone they had used when they were young, and she was still strong enough to laugh at such boldness. But she tightened her jaw and shook her head with a feeble but stubborn determination that reminded them of the queen she once was. Her ribs protruded beneath her gown, the fabric sagging where her body had withered. Her collarbones cast sharp shadows across her skin, and when they lifted her hand to wash it, her wrist felt as light as a bird's, fragile and cold. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor beneath the powder, as though the color of life were draining away, leaving only the faintest reminder of her former radiance. Lesions along her jaw and neck festered, hidden beneath thick coats of white lead that cracked and gathered in the folds of her skin. The sores on her arms wept constantly, staining her sleeves and leaving a faint smell of infection that clung to her no matter how often her ladies changed her linens. She flinched whenever cloth touched her body, the rawness of her skin making even the gentlest contact feel like a lash. And yet, despite this unbearable state, she refused to remain in bed. She insisted on sitting upright on the floor cushions, claiming she could breathe better that way. Though her breath rattled and wheezed with each attempt, her ladies brought pillows to support her back, arranging them around her trembling frame so she could lean without collapsing. She sat there for hours, sometimes rocking slowly back and forth, sometimes perfectly still, like a statue carved from bone and sorrow. When she did speak, it was often to the empty corners of the room, her voice cracking as she addressed shadows only she could see. She began to resist sleep entirely. Whenever her eyes drifted closed, she startled violently, clutching her chest, gasping as though something had clawed her from within. She begged her ladies not to let her sleep, insisting that dreams waited for her. Dark dreams filled with faces she could no longer bear to see. She said the shadows whispered to her, calling her by name, promising things she did not want to hear. She pleaded with her ladies to keep candles lit through the night, but even the light could not stop the visions that rolled through her mind with fevered insistence. Her fever burned hotter. Sweat soaked her nightgown, glistening in the candlelight as her breaths came harsh and rapid. Her hair clung to her forehead in thin, tangled strands, and her ladies gently brushed it away, though she recoiled from their touch as if their fingertips carried fire. She muttered incoherently, her eyes rolling beneath half-closed lids, her hands clawing weakly at the blankets as though trying to grasp something just out of reach. At times she screamed thin, hoarse sounds that tore through the quiet halls, then fell silent again, her body trembling violently before going limp with exhaustion. News of her condition spread through the palace like a cold wind. Servants paused in their duties to whisper prayers. Courtiers began to dress in darker colors, though no official mourning had yet been declared. Counselors spoke in hushed tones, their voices heavy with the weight of decisions that would soon require action. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent messages home, reporting what little they had gathered from the frightened servants who passed them in the corridors. And through all of it, the court waited, trapped in a tension that strained every breath, every footstep, every hour. Her closest attendants could no longer hide the truth even from themselves. The queen was dying. Her body was failing, her mind fraying, her spirit flickering like a candle burned nearly to the wick. They watched her with the aching helplessness of those who must witness a great suffering without the power to ease it. They wiped her brow. Though the fever returned minutes later, they offered her water, though she refused it more often than she accepted it. They sat beside her, holding her hands when she allowed them, whispering comfort even as tears streaked down their cheeks. She slipped more and more into visions. She insisted her parents stood beside her. She spoke to Henry as though he admonished her for failing in ways she could not name. She reached out toward the space where she claimed her mother knelt, weeping that she had tried to be strong, that she had tried to be good, that she had tried to be worthy. She apologized repeatedly, her voice trembling, asking forgiveness for sins she had carried in silence for decades. Her ladies could not bear to ask what those sins were. She spoke to Mary, to Edward, to Robert Dudley, to the countless souls who had shaped her life, begging some of them to stay, begging others to leave her in peace. She saw death in the corners of her chamber. She said shadows gathering like cloaked figures, waiting for her to fall asleep so they could collect her. She refused to rest because she feared she would not wake again. And so she fought through the night, her eyes glassy with terror, her breath shaky, her hands gripping the cushions as though anchoring herself to life. Then she grew quieter. Her outbursts subsided, her muttering slowed. The fever-wild movements of her limbs diminished. A stillness settled over her that was almost peaceful, though her ladies recognized it for what it was, the slowing of a body nearing its end. Her breath became softer, fainter, her chest rising only slightly with each inhale. Her head drooped forward, her chin resting lightly against her collarbone, her shoulders sagging under the weight of exhaustion, decades in the making. The court held its breath. The queen was fading, and with her faded the final remnants of an age defined by her will, her brilliance, her contradictions, and her suffering. She had fought harder than any monarch before her, not against armies or foreign crowns, but against the slow and merciless collapse of her own mortal form. And now, at last, that war was reaching its final moments. All that remained was the last surrender. The final hours of her life unfolded with a strange, reverent quiet, as though the palace itself understood that its long-standing heartbeat was faltering and dared not disturb the fragile rhythm that remained. The corridors were still. The servants moved like shadows. Even the wind outside seemed to hush itself against the stone walls of Richmond, as if it too wished to bear witness without intrusion. Inside her chamber the candles burned low, their flames trembling in unison with the faint, uneven rise of her breath, each flicker reflecting on the powder-masked face that only barely concealed the devastation beneath. Her ladies knelt beside her, their eyes swollen from nights without sleep, their hands gently resting near her in case she reached out, though she had not reached for anything in hours. They whispered prayers not to comfort her. Her mind had drifted too far to hear, but to steady themselves in the presence of a suffering so profound it left them trembling. She sat still on her cushions, her body too wasted to support its own weight without the layered pillows behind her spine. Her head bowed slightly forward as though in deep contemplation, though her thoughts had long since slipped into places beyond mortal speech. Her hands, once adorned with rings she wore like declarations of power, now lay bare and frail, the bones sharp beneath skin thinned by disease and fever. The tremors that had shaken her for weeks had quieted into the occasional twitch of her fingers, small movements that spoke of a nervous system frayed to its final threads. Her breath rattled softly in her chest, a wet, fragile sound that made her ladies hold their breath each time, unsure if the next inhale would come. Her eyes remained half open, the pupils unfocused, reflecting the dim glow of the candlelight as though she were looking through the room rather than at it. Sometimes her breath caught, and for a heartbeat she seemed to gather herself, as if searching for a voice that had abandoned her. Her lips parted slightly, moving without sound, shaping words no one could hear. Her ladies leaned closer, desperate to decipher the final whispers of the woman they had served for decades. But no sound came, only a thin exhale, warm for a second before fading into the cold air of the chamber. She no longer spoke to the shadows she had once feared. She no longer called for her mother, her father, or the long-dead figures who had crowded her fevered visions. The ghosts seemed to have stepped back, their presence no longer tugging at her consciousness. Perhaps she had wandered past the point where memory could reach her. Or perhaps she had finally found a place in her mind beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond the tangle of regrets that had tormented her in the weeks before. Whatever world she now inhabited, it was one she carried silently, sealed behind the brittle mask of her final hours. Outside her chamber, the counselors gathered, their faces drawn and pale as they strained to hear any news from within. They spoke in low murmurs about succession, about the future, about the weight of a death that would reshape the nation, but their words felt hollow, overshadowed by the reality that in the room behind them, a chapter of history was inching toward its end with every weak flutter of breath. They dared not approach. They dared not interrupt. They could only wait, pacing quietly across the wooden floors, listening for footsteps that might signal the inevitable message. Her ladies remained by her side, too afraid to leave her even for a moment. They dabbed her forehead with a cool cloth, though the fever had mostly burned itself out, leaving her skin clammy and pale. They touched her hand gently, hoping she might squeeze back, but her fingers remained still, curled inward as though holding something only she could feel. One of them brushed a stray strand of thinning hair from her cheek, her touch trembling with love and sorrow. The queen did not move. At one point her breathing paused. The room froze. Her ladies leaned in, their hearts seizing in their chest. Then a shallow inhale came, thin and rattling, barely enough to stir the air. It was relief and heartbreak in the same moment. They wanted her suffering to end, yet the thought of losing her, of watching the queen they had served crumble into the silence of death, felt unbearable. Her chest rose again, then fell. Minutes passed between breaths now, each one softer than the last, as though her body were releasing its hold on the world one thread at a time. Her ladies whispered to her, telling her she had been strong, telling her she had done enough, telling her she could rest. She did not respond, but one of them thought she saw a flicker in the queen's eyes, a faint, fragile glimmer that might have been comprehension or simply the reflection of the dimming candlelight. As dawn crept toward the horizon, the room grew colder. The air tasted different, thinner, sharper, as though reality itself were shifting in preparation. Her breath slowed to a soft flutter, her lips parting slightly as though she meant to speak. Her head tilted gently to the side, her cheeks sinking into the folds of the cushion. Her eyes, half open until now, drifted shut with the slow deliberation of someone laying down a burden they had carried for far too long. Her ladies held their breath. Her chest rose faintly, then fell, and did not rise again. For a long moment the world remained suspended in silence, as if refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. The candles flickered. A soft raindrop tapped against the windowpane. The air seemed to hold its own breath. Then one of her ladies reached forward with shaking fingers, gently pressed her hand against the queen's still neck, and bowed her head in quiet, devastating certainty. The Virgin Queen was gone. The woman who had carried an empire on her back, who had faced rebellions and assassins and invading fleets, who had shaped a golden age through sheer force of will, had finally surrendered to the slow, merciless decay that had haunted her in the last years of her life. Her suffering had ended, but the sorrow of witnessing it would linger forever in the hearts of those who had watched the nightmare consume her. The palace erupted into motion. Bells were muffled and prepared. Messengers were sent to fetch counselors. Servants dressed in black poured into the hallways. The news spread like a tremor through the stone, sparking whispers, gasps, sobs, and hurried steps. And yet, even as history began moving forward again, her ladies remained kneeling around her, unwilling to leave her side, their tears falling silently onto the floor where she had spent so many agonizing nights. Preparations for the final ritual began almost immediately, because even in death she was required to wear the mask. Embalmers entered the room with solemn faces, carrying jars and cloths and brushes. Her ladies watched with hollow eyes as her body was lifted gently onto the bed, her limbs stiff and fragile as porcelain. The embalmers removed the layers of fabric, revealing the ravaged skin beneath, gray and mottled, marred by scars and lesions hidden for years beneath the thick white paste. They cleaned her carefully, their movements reverent, though even they flinched at the sight of the damage time and poison had inflicted. Then came the final cruelty. They reconstructed the mask. Layer after layer of white lead was applied to her cold skin, smoothing over the ravages of sickness, hiding the truth she had fought so desperately to conceal. Vermilion was brushed onto her lips to mimic the flush of life. Her hair was arranged with care, padding added beneath her cheeks to restore fullness. Her crown placed gently atop her head as though she might wake and reclaim it. By the time they finished, the body on the bed looked like a queen again, ethereal, serene, untouched by decay. But her ladies knew better. They had seen the truth beneath the mask. They had smelled the rot, felt the fever, heard the trembling breath, and they would carry the memory of the real Elizabeth, the woman who endured unimaginable pain in silence, who fought until her last breath, who died holding on to her dignity even as her body crumbled beneath her for the rest of their lives. Outside, the bells of England began tolling. A reign had ended. A nightmare had ended. And the woman beneath the crown, after a lifetime of wearing a mask that poisoned her, was finally free.